In the most recent patch, solo dungeons have just changed, allowing them to level up over time, similar to open world mobs. So you'll now be able to find enchanted dungeons like the ones from Solo Dungeon maps, just lying out in the open world without having to spend the money on actually buying the maps and popping them. Because of this and recent balance changes, I thought it would be a good time to revisit what the best solo fame farming weapon is for solo dungeons and for solo open world mobs. Now, very quickly before we get into how I tested this and the results, it's important to understand that there is no one best build or one best weapon for doing solo dungeons and killing mobs in the open world like this, although I'll cover this much more in the discussion section of this video, so make sure you check that out as it's a really important thing to understand. So in order to test which weapon was the fastest, I took a really standard base solo fame farming build with a Cowl of Purity, Cultist Robe, Leather Shoes, Thetford Cape, Beef Stews, and then I didn't really use potions but took energy potions just in case. I then went out with 3 different weapons that I wanted to test. We have the light crossbow with the Mistcaller as our offhand, which was classically sort of viewed as the best for solo fame farming coming into the last balance patch. Then we also have the Great Axe, which used to be the king of solo fame farming, but it got nerfed, got a bunch of changes. In the last balance patch, they removed the negative damage to mobs, so I wanted to test out if it's back to where it was or close to where it was before. And then lastly, we have the Spiked Gauntlets, which got some pretty massive buffs and then a slight nerf, but still seem like they'll be a really solid weapon for killing mobs. For the weapons, I made sure all of the IP for the weapons was right around 1200 IP. So I took all 3 of these weapons and then did some flat tier 7 solo dungeon maps, as well as killed some mobs in the tier 6 red zone in the open world, and tracked how much fame I was getting per hour. Using that fame per hour average, we can get a relatively good idea of how fast these weapons can fame farm. One thing to note is that when I was doing these solo dungeons, I skipped all of the bosses in the solo dungeons because those add to the most variability that I could have gotten in the fame per hour, so I just completely skipped them. Make sure to keep that in mind when looking at the results. So looking at the results, the first thing that I noticed after a little bit of testing was that the Great Axe just simply wasn't stacking up to the other 2 weapons. It was pretty significantly slower, and so I just stopped testing it and focused on the other 2 weapons instead. Now, just quickly to note, when I say significantly slower, I do not mean that the Great Axe is a bad solo fame farming weapon. It was actually quite good, it's just we're looking at the very best, and so even small margins like 10 to 15, 20% slower is actually really significant. If you like Great Axe and like fame farming with it and like PvPing with it, I would highly suggest still using it to fame farm, as it is a very good fame farm weapon, all things considered. It's just a little bit slower than the light crossbow and the Spiked Gauntlets. Adding in the results from the light crossbow and Spiked Gauntlets now, you can see that they're pretty similar, both a little bit higher than the Great Axe, and they're very similar to each other, with the Spiked Gauntlets coming out just a little bit on top. Most notably, I would say, is the difference in the open world, as in solo dungeons, they're pretty similar in terms of clear speed. Honestly, if I were to test more, they'd probably be right around the exact same amount of fame per hour for solo dungeons. However, the open world, there is a significant difference. The Spiked Gauntlets are just so specialized at killing the open world mobs. You can dismount, press that instant cast E, and just instantly kill most mobs. They're very strong for it, and so especially for killing the open world mobs, Spiked Gauntlets seem to be very strong. So really quickly before we get into the biggest sort of weakness of this test or limitation, just some small things to know. The first is that the Spiked Gauntlets in particular, while they did come out on top, are probably the worst out of all of these at killing bosses and really high tier mobs. Now, since I mostly skipped these in solo dungeons and found very few of them in the open world, in fact I skipped any of the spiky bosses that I saw just so I would completely throw off the results if I got a spiky for one and not the others, it kind of leans towards favoring the Spiked Gauntlets in the test a little bit. Spiked Gauntlet's strength really comes in able to one-shotting groups of mobs with their E ability, but their consistent damage from their Q and W and auto attacks isn't really that high compared to something like the light crossbow with that Q2 spam. This brings out another weakness of the spiked gauntlets, and that is that I was doing flat tier 7 maps with 1200 IP gauntlets and tier 6 mobs in the open world. As you go up in tiers, for example, if you were to try to do an 8.3 dungeon with the spiked gauntlets, your E probably wouldn't be one-shotting most of the mobs, which would really lower the efficiency of the weapon. So really it shines when the E is just able to one-shot most of the mobs and not overkill them too much and not underkill them too much. If you can one-shot them with the E, it's very, very strong, but if you can't, then it's probably going to start getting a little bit less efficient. Another thing to note is the lack of specialized builds, so I just used a standard build for all of them to try to isolate how strong the weapons were in particular. However, that build is probably a little bit stronger for some weapons than it is for other weapons. In particular, it seemed to be pretty good with spiked gauntlets, as having the Cowl of Purity is really good for pulling multiple mobs together into a group, and so really good for weapons like the Great Axe and spiked gauntlets that just want to clear a bunch of mobs with their E, and probably a little bit weaker for the light crossbow, which doesn't really care as much about getting really big pulls. If you take these two things together, you could probably say that light crossbow is pretty much the exact same, or maybe even a little bit better than the spiked gauntlets for solo dungeons in particular. That being said, I do still think that spiked gauntlets are going to be the best for the open world, just because of how good the build and play stuff for spiked gauntlets works compared to the open world mobs. Just being able to one-shot the big ones is very, very powerful. I alluded to this in the intro a little bit, but the most important thing to understand when looking at the best weapon or best build for solo fame farming, like doing solo dungeon, is that that is sort of an untrue statement already. There is no one best build or one best weapon for doing solo dungeons and for doing solo open world mobs. The reason for this is because it's all about benchmarks. If we take solo dungeons for an example, the best build and the best weapon to clear a solo dungeon is going to be completely dependent on how high your IP is, what tier the dungeon is, and even what faction of mobs are found within the dungeon. This is because the most efficient way to clear is always going to be about having good damage benchmarks compared to average mob health or common mob health. Basically, if the average mob in that dungeon, or the most common mob you're going to come across, has 1000 HP and your main clearing ability does like 1.2k damage, then you're really only wasting like 200 damage on average when you're clearing. However, if your weapon has its main clearing ability doing say 2000 damage and you're sort of wasting 1000 damage on clear speed, or on the other hand, if it does like 500 damage, then you're having to make up 500 damage somewhere else. So the best weapon to clear and the best dungeons to do is always going to be about matching your main clearing ability with the appropriate strength of dungeon and strength of mobs. This is really, really important with something like spiked gauntlets, for example. If I was doing tier 8 mobs in the open world with 1200 IP gauntlets, if my E didn't one-shot them and I had to use like a W or 2 Qs on mobs to finish them off, it would become significantly less efficient. So basically, what I'm trying to say with all of this is that if somebody claims that this is the best solo dungeon clearing build or weapon like this video is doing, they're lying. There is no one best solo dungeon clearing weapon. There is no best one build best at clearing open world mobs. It completely depends on your situation and what you're going up against. So when you're looking at this video and looking at the results, don't take it as this is the best weapon, this is the best build, this is what I have to use when I do solo dungeons or open world mobs. Instead, this is giving you a general idea of sort of the best weapons for doing the solo fame farming and how they generally stack up to each other in an average fame farm session. If you really want to find the most efficient thing for you, you're going to have to do some testing. Anyways, that's all for this video. Happy fame farming. I hope it helped you out, and I will see you in the next one.